miigwech. So I just thank the grandmothers, the grandfathers, and the Creator for coming to be with us this morning, this day, I guess. Thank all of you for coming and taking the time to be here. And also just coming with an open mind. Just talked about the medicine that we used this morning to clear all your thoughts and that everybody's present to what's going to be talked about today. And also just acknowledge the medicines that we use and carry all the gifts and resources we get from the lands and the waters. We're grateful and thankful for the ones that we use every day. And also just that whatever discussions that are going to be had today, that they come from that good place, and also from that I asked them to help and guide and support you in the work that you're going to be doing in what's going to be discussed today. So I say miigwech for that. So that's a big thank you to all of you, all your input. There's a lot of knowledge here, a lot of experience. So just ask them to gather all of you together to bring those good thoughts and good intentions and to guide and support you in the work that you do with this and also in the work that you do otherwise. And so I say miigwech for that. I'm going to say thank you for the tobacco that I was given to come and also be here just to do the prayer for you, open your circle in a good way. So I say miigwech for that. And also just a reminder that Creator loved all of us and gave us everything that we needed to live in that good way and to walk on a good path. And so I say miigwech for that. So I say thank you, and I guess we're ready to get started. Oh yeah, I'm supposed to talk about ALS. So Aboriginal Legal Services, I've been here 6 years, but I knew about it for a long time. So it started in 1991. And so it's a place where our people can go to feel supported in going through that justice system that really doesn't work for us. And so a lot of our people come through these doorways. And so to have a space like this healing, this grandmother's lodge is really something new. And they're still kind of afraid to come because it's still through the courts. But we help a lot of families, children, we have a youth court, and we also do like sentencing circles upstairs in the courtrooms on the 9th floor. And we also do family mediation circles here because a lot of our kids are in care. So we hold these circles here and so that the families can come into this space. And it was created because there was a need, for the community through the TRC, another step in also from the ministry recognizing that our people needed a space in the courtroom. In the courthouse, not sure how that's really going to play out because it's still the courtroom. So I meet a lot of people and I work with a lot of people that kind of are hesitant about coming through those security and because it brings out those emotions, right? It brings out those things. And it's not just the current emotions, but it's the current emotions from what we brought forth from our intergenerations of having to deal with the court system, the police, all those institutions, not just justice, but also health, education, and all those things. So so it's Aboriginal Legal Services really does try to see those things that are needed by the community and try to listen to what the community is saying and what is needed. So I'm happy that everybody's gathered today to really talk about this important issue that, the TRC, and what does that mean? How is that going to be implemented? And so we just don't need to really talk a lot about it. We need to have action and to put forth those steps and those dreams, and to allow our young people especially to have those dreams come true, to be able to have an opportunity to change the path that they're on. So that's what Aboriginal Legal Services, I think, really tries to do, to, just kind of change their path a little bit, because the path that I see when I work with people is child welfare, prison, so those are go straight, right? So, but there are so many other options, and I hope those options can be more clear, and our people can see, that there is an opportunity for them to change, to have a dream, and to have that dream come true. And so we need the support. And so listen to the truth. And I kind of missed that teaching this morning about having that medicine go over your mouth, because that's where we need to talk about truth. And until you learn that truth and are able to say it and talk about it, even though it is painful and it is hard to talk about, that's what we need to do. Have very, how do you say that, straight up conversations. So I say, Miigwech, thank you.
Okay. Okay. Good morning, everyone, and thank you all for joining us here today. It's my pleasure to be here today. And I want to begin by thanking Grandmother Dorothy Peters. Thank you for your comments and bringing us all into your learning and perspective, including in connection with the legal justice system in such a thoughtful and grounding way. Thank you very much. Her words remind us of the responsibility we carry into this discussion and the spirit in which we have to approach it. I'd also like to thank the entire Aboriginal Legal Services team for all their support in putting this event together. Today marks our first roundtable focused on Indigenous issues as part of the OSC's Action Plan for Truth and Reconciliation. It is a meaningful milestone, the beginning of a series of conversations about how reconciliation can and must be embedded in our markets and in all of our work. The draft action plan reflects the OSC's role in reconciliation with Indigenous peoples and our responsibility to contribute meaningfully to this national imperative. It is grounded in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action, especially those that speak to the corporate sector and economic reconciliation. As a securities regulator, we recognize that reconciliation is not only a moral and social obligation, it's also a matter of economic inclusion and systemic fairness. Indigenous peoples continue to face barriers to full participation in the economy and the capital markets generally. Addressing these barriers is essential to building a more inclusive, resilient, and trusted financial system. We have to ensure that Ontario's capital markets are inviting, thriving, and secure for everybody, especially those that have historically been excluded or marginalized in their participation in the capital markets. Our role as a regulator gives us a unique platform to influence change through our regulatory work, our engagement with market participants, and our own internal policies. Our vision for Indigenous reconciliation, which was developed through engagement with Indigenous partners, is both a commitment and a call to action. First, we commit to building a workforce that's culturally safe and aware and inclusive. This means investing in education and creating space for Indigenous perspectives. Second, we commit to working with Indigenous peoples and communities, investors, market participants, and partners. Our goal is to have meaningful relationships built on trust, transparency, and respect, with Indigenous perspectives considered throughout our work. This work supports key organizational priorities such as enhancing trust in capital markets, driving innovation and economic development, and cultivating a resilient and inclusive organizational culture. The draft action plan is built around 5 pillars. Some focus on internal change, such as strengthening our capacity and awareness. Today's session brings together external partners to explore pillars 4 and 5 of the framework. Pillar 4 highlights key market practices such as disclosure, investor protection, and equitable access to capital. Pillar 5 emphasizes partnerships and ecosystem development, including collaboration with Indigenous organizations, governments, and regulators to foster lasting, coordinated impact. These pillars reflect how reconciliation can be meaningfully advanced through market practice and collaborative efforts. We recognize that reconciliation cannot be advanced in isolation. Meaningful progress is only possible through respectful collaboration with Indigenous organizations, leaders, and market participants. This begins with listening, honoring past contributions, and engaging in ways that are thoughtful, informed, and grounded in mutual respect. We won't get everything right the first time, but we can demonstrate credibility through responsiveness, honest humility, and openness to adjustment and change going forward. So with that framing, I'm very pleased to welcome and introduce our panelists whose insights will help guide today's dialogue. Joining us are Sherry Brandt, partner and national leader, Indigenous Law, Borden Ladner Gervais, LLP. Clint Davis, Chief Executive Officer, Cedar Leaf Capital. Carol Ann Hilton, Chief Executive Officer in Indigenomics Institute. Tom Hunter, Senior Advisor of Indigenous Engagement with the Canadian Securities Administrators. Mayan Marcin Gudar, Director, Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation with Scotiabank, and Scott Monroe, Chief Executive Officer, First Nations Financial Management Board. So thank you all for being part of this conversation today. I now look forward to turning things over to Cullen Price, our Associate General Counsel, Litigation and Strategic Priorities, to lead us in today's discussion.
Thank you, Grant. And thank you very much, Grandmother Dorothy, for opening us in such a good way today. I'd also like to recognize that we're hosted on the treaty lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit, and we are grateful for their continued stewardship of these lands and waters. For those who don't know me, my name is Cullen Price. I'm originally from Quebec's Eastern Townships, which is Abenaki territory, and I now live in the Williams Treaty Territory. To begin, let me address our audience members directly. We wanted to thank you very much for your time and energy today. We very much look forward to receiving your feedback. And to do this, we'd like to encourage you to insert comments or questions into the Q&A function on the webinar. We'll do our best to get to as many of these as possible today. I'll also note later on, as I wrap up, some other ways that you can provide us feedback. Now, in the balance of my short time, I'll help set the stage for this conversation. I won't steal the limelight from this group of all-star panelists. I'll get to it as quickly as possible. I'll start with a quick refresher of what the OSC is, and then I'll provide a brief overview of our action plan for truth and reconciliation. Let me begin with a very brief description of what the OSC does. In short, we're the capital markets regulator for Ontario. What are the capital markets? Well, the capital markets can be seen as the ecosystem that drives economic growth by bringing folks with capital, the investors, to the businesses who need the capital, the funds to grow and innovate. These investments are represented by securities, like stocks or bonds. Let me now turn to our mandate. First, it's important to note that we do not provide funds into the system. Rather, we set and enforce the rules for the market to ensure that investors are protected, the markets are fair, efficient, and competitive, and that capital can flow into the markets. Let me now turn to our journey so far into truth and reconciliation. Over the past 3 years, the OSC has reflected on its role in advancing truth and reconciliation. We began by listening and learning from First Nations, Métis, and Inuit voices, from colleagues across government, from the folks that you see here today, and organizations leading this work. This journey has required, as Grant noted, humility, openness, and willingness to acknowledge the systemic barriers that exist within our markets and institutions. It's also required us to look inward, to examine our own culture, our policies, and our decision-making processes. This draft action plan represents the culmination of that effort. The result is a draft plan that is both practical and aspirational. Practical in the sense that it sets out concrete steps, and aspirational in that it points us towards the organization that we strive to be. Let me now turn quickly to our preliminary vision for truth and reconciliation. Our vision is to build an OSC where reconciliation is embedded in everything we do, from our governance and workplace culture to our regulatory and policy work. Our vision is one of inclusion, accountability, and partnership, grounded in respect for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit rights, histories, and cultures. But what do we understand truth and reconciliation to mean? In the context of our work and our plan, when we speak of truth, we are acknowledging a difficult reality. Indigenous peoples have been systematically excluded from full participation in the economy, including the capital markets. That's not all that the truth means. There are many other hard truths, but we focus on that truth as it relates to our work. Recognizing this truth is about understanding the structural barriers that have limited access and opportunity. Reconciliation, then, is not a one-time event or even a once-a-year event. It's an ongoing commitment to listen, to learn, and to act. It means engaging directly with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities, businesses, and organizations, not just to hear their perspectives, but to truly understand their experiences within the capital markets. And it means reflecting. And Grandmother Dorothy encouraged us to reflect this morning. And that's the real hard work. It's not just a moral imperative, as Grant noted. It's a strategic one. A more inclusive capital market is a stronger, more resilient one. Let me now turn to the action plan. The action plan is built on 5 pillars. Each pillar includes draft commitments and an accountability structure. As we see here, the first pillar is governance and leadership. At the OSC, we are embedding reconciliation at the very highest levels of the organization, represented by the folks we see here today. Leadership and governance structures will be accountable for advancing this work in a meaningful way. We'll actively seek First Nations, Métis, and Inuit perspectives to guide our decisions and shape our long-term strategy. In doing so, reconciliation will become an integral part of how we govern ourselves rather than a separate initiative. Pillar 2 is about people and employment. In this pillar, we're focused on creating a workplace that is inclusive, supportive, and culturally safe. This means building stronger pathways for recruitment, retention, and advancement of Indigenous employees. It also means ensuring staff have opportunities to learn and build cultural competency so that truth and reconciliation is reflected in our daily interactions. The third pillar is education and awareness. As we know, education is essential to truth and reconciliation. We recall the words of the Honorable Murray Sinclair, who said, we got into this mess with education and we'll get out of it with education. Training on First Nations, Métis, and Inuit histories, rights, and cultures will increase awareness and understanding across the organization. Knowledge sharing will help us reduce unconscious bias and foster stronger awareness. This ongoing learning will ensure that every engagement we have is informed, respectful, and grounded in understanding. Pillar 4, community and economic engagement. Here we focus on building meaningful partnerships with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities, businesses, and organizations. This is hard work. It means on-the-ground, everyday actions. Our commitment includes supporting Indigenous economic participation and removing barriers to accessing capital markets. We will engage by listening, co-designing, and ensuring initiatives reflect community needs. Through this work, we aim to contribute to prosperity and inclusion in Ontario's economy. Pillar 5, regulatory and policy work. This is maybe where the rubber hits the road for this work. Here we plan to review and adapt our rules, policies, and oversight practices through a reconciliation lens. This means identifying and removing systemic barriers that First Nations, Métis, and Inuit face in our regulatory framework. Equity, fairness, and accessibility will be embedded directly into how we regulate Ontario's capital markets. And by doing so, we will ensure that our markets are more inclusive, supportive of Indigenous participation. Together, these 5 pillars form the foundation of our draft plan. And now let's turn to how you, the audience, can participate in this process. As we move forward, your feedback is not just welcome, it's essential. We recognize that the strength of the draft action plan lies in its ability to reflect diverse perspectives. That's why we've built in multiple ways for you to provide your feedback and to strengthen the plan. We welcome your engagement today. As I mentioned, you can add a comment or really trenchant questions for our panelists in the webinar Q&A function. And if you prefer a one-on-one conversation, you can request a meeting or a phone call. And you're also encouraged to submit written feedback if you so choose. And we encourage you all to provide this feedback by October 31st. Your insights will help shape the inaugural version of our plan. Now, you've heard too much about me and our plan. Let's get on to the all-star panel. And I'll introduce our panelists, our moderators. Yes, grandmother.
I just wanted to make a comment. When you're talking about pillars, you could change the language and say circle 1, circle 2, because in our way of looking at things, everything's circular and everybody's included and everybody's at that same level. So everything is really good when you're talking about what everything is under those pillars. But I think if you're going to engage and acknowledge all those things, the worldview is circular. So if you say circle 1, circle 2, I think it will work much better.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the feedback. All right, let's move on to introduce our 2 moderators. First off, we have Nizam Kanji, the OSC General Counsel and Executive Vice President, Legal and Governance. And we also have José Turcotte, Executive Vice President, Chief of Staff, and Chief Operating Officer. Over to you.
Thank you, Colin, and welcome everyone. We are honored to be here today for this important conversation on the OSC Draft Action Plan. In keeping with a relational approach, we have invited each panelist to begin their first comments by sharing a brief introduction, not only about their professional background, but also about the communities, relationships, and experiences that shapes their perspectives. So this helps us open the space in a spirit of respect and shared understanding. To get started, I've been asked to do this myself, so I'm José Turcotte, Chief Operating Officer and Chief of Staff. I was born and raised in Quebec City in a francophone environment, Quebec City being primarily located on the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat Nation. Later on, I pursued my studies and career in Ontario and moved in the 1990s. And currently, I'm living with my immediate family in the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Adenaunashi, and the Wendat Nation in Toronto. Nizam, would you like to say a few words about you?
Thank you, Jose. I'm Nizam Kanji, General Counsel and Executive Vice President, Legal and Governance. I've been at the Ontario Securities Commission for 25 years in various roles. I'm originally from Kenya. I was born in Kisumu, Kenya. I came to Canada in 1990 to study and then have stayed here since then. My family is originally from India. They immigrated to East Africa as part of the British Empire, I guess. And they were one part of my family. My mother's side was expelled from Uganda in 1972 by Idi Amin, and Canada took us in and allowed us to make this our home. So we're very grateful for that. And I'm really looking forward to participating in today's discussion and working with all of you going forward to make sure this is a real meaningful discussion and outcome going forward.
Great, thank you, Nizam. So we'd like to start the discussion on Pillar 4 in the OSC Draft Action Plan, which is focused on the OSC engagement with Indigenous communities. Let's begin with the first question. Does the draft plan meaningfully address barriers Indigenous businesses and communities face in accessing capital or participating in financial markets? What could be missing in our plan? And I would like to invite Clint to lead us off. Clint.
And Ulakut. So thank you and good morning in Nunutitut. First of all, I want to say it's so wonderful to see so many exceptionally incredibly intelligent friends, colleagues who are there. As Colin talked about the All-Star panel, I love that sports analogy, particularly since a little event happened last night in Toronto, which is great. But I just wanted to say, look, you want to get the right people in the room to provide this feedback. Without a doubt, you have them there. And so it is, so I wish I was there in person. Unfortunately, that could not happen. And I want to say nakumek to the OSC for accommodating me. So just a few comments. Does it meaningfully address the barriers for Indigenous business communities with respect to engagement in capital markets? So the short answer is yes. Couple of things. The fact that you have senior leadership involved and committed to this particular process is invaluable. And it's a very inclusive process where you consistently make reference to First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, recognizing the diversity of our nations. Change can be initiated by anybody in an organization at any particular level, but for it to be sustainable, you need to have senior executive support. And without a doubt, this is what we see here today. What I find impressive is the plan does provide significant commitments on the part of the OSC to create that inclusive and supportive, trusting environment. And you talk about the inclusion of Indigenous people on committees, outreach to schools and so on for employment, and a commitment to greater education. And these will, without a doubt, will establish a much more trusting and authentic relationship between the OSC and Indigenous communities. I also see this question in a much broader way. And frankly, the action plan is an exceptionally strong foundation to meaningfully address the barriers facing Indigenous nations and businesses to participate in capital markets. So my comments are particularly with respect to debt capital markets because Cedar Leaf Capital, Canada's first Indigenous majority-owned investment dealer, is actively involved in DCM, and so that's what we see on a daily basis. Indigenous nations can participate and have participated in capital markets on two fronts. As an issuer, and we've seen this just recently, first of all, the First Nations Finance Authority has been doing this on a regular basis, as well as just recently Stone Lessick 8, but also as an investor. When I consider the barriers on the issuer front, they often include scale, smaller capital raises, which can be a bit tough for debt capital markets, particularly at the primary market stage, lack of track record and experience. Very few Indigenous communities have already participated, and so building up that track record and experience is significant, and then a perception of risk by the investors. On the investor side, oh, sorry, are you still there?
Yes,
Okay, my apologies, something just came in.
I can hear you.
Great. On the investor side, Indigenous communities have accumulated significant wealth over the last number of years in aggregate, more than $80 billion over the last 20 to 30 years, which is expected to grow by at least another 60 billion over the next 10 years. Virtually all of that capital is managed by large and medium-sized asset managers who are now just recently starting to manage capital in a manner that reflects Indigenous values, priorities. So two of the roles of the OSC, as was stated earlier, and I want to say, Cullen, thank you so much for setting the context and the tone, is that two of the roles is to foster fair, efficient, and competitive capital markets and confidence in capital markets, and to foster capital formation. So I believe for the OSC, thought leadership, encouraging investors to consider Indigenous investments, to encourage investors to really have a look at what the real risk would be associated with some of these deals, and influence on other jurisdictions. Ontario certainly has the largest provincial population, second largest Indigenous communities in the country, largest Indigenous population. Having said that, the West and BC is also significant in terms of the greatest number of communities as well as the population. I also think by this encouragement, this thought leadership, it's also aligned with the Ontario Securities Commission strategic plan, in particular to be a trusted, influential voice in capital markets and to foster those conditions for innovation in public and private markets. When we look at Indigenous participation in capital markets, it's new, it's innovative, and it's extremely exciting. I think one of the things I'd like to see, and I'd encourage the OSC to consider, is to have a deep understanding when you look at issuers on the issuing side of communities, to take into account the decision-making processes of these communities, to understand what their priorities are, and to recognize the diversities of our nation across the country. So with that, Nakumik.
Thank you, Clint. This is great feedback, and we really appreciate your thoughts. I would like now to invite other panelists to share their thoughts. And again, please feel free to begin with a brief introduction that reflects your connections and partnership. And perhaps I could start with Mayan, and I will go clockwise. Mayan.
Sure. So, Mayan Marsan-Gadar. I am mixed Ojibwe and settler descent. My traditional territories are the Chippewa-Rama First Nation. I'm also a member of the Métis Nation of Ontario, which reflects and honors that mixed ancestry. I do actually want to preface, and it's something I think Cullen, you and I have talked about, and Josie, that I approach this conversation in a slightly different way. Grandmother Dorothy, I just wanted to first, before I get into to honor and thank you for opening in a good way. I just personally, I often get intimidated in environments like this, and your presence just helps really ground me and make me feel comfortable. So Chimigwich. The work I do at Scotiabank is a little bit different than the folks perhaps around this circle and with Clint. Actually, Clint put it perfectly a few weeks ago in calling me a generalist. And the work that I'm doing at Scotiabank is a little bit different in the sense that we're leading the development of a reconciliation strategy that is enterprise-wide and focused both on economic and social outcomes. And so, I'm not an expert in capital markets, and the advice I got from my team coming into this is don't pretend to be an expert in something you're not. And so just with that context, given the specific nature of this question, I'm actually going to hand it over to whomever else would like to talk specifically about capital markets.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you for having me here today. And I think that I feel fairly blessed here that we're sitting amongst such powerful thinkers and some real action makers. I'm Tom Hunter. I am from Treaty 4 originally. I now live in Calgary, Alberta, and that's Treaty 7. I'm from the Papikasas Cree First Nation, and I started my venture down this path was, as many will look when they're on the long end of their careers, they look back about how they became to be at the point that they're sitting. And if I told you I was a microbiologist from the energy sector, you guys might think you're in the wrong spot. But I do have many experiences, lived career in energy, a 25-year career in the energy sector, and so I've seen a lot of things done the wrong way and almost the right way. So I've gathered a lot of experience and knowledge in that aspect, and most recently in the last decade or so, I've moved towards really contributing back as much as I can to the reconciliation efforts. I think about where I was, say in 2004. I can recall this specific conversation with a fellow peer at my same oil and gas company, and we were talking about First Nations people, and we came to the plight of the First Nations people. And he said, "Tom, what can we do?" And it was such a complex and big problem that my mind couldn't even start thinking about it. I think about myself then, and I think about where we are today, and we've had a lot of work put towards mapping things out, and we've had the Honorable Murray Sinclair kind of give us a framework and a roadmap to achieving reconciliation. And so 2004 to today, I see this problem in front of us that it doesn't seem that much of a problem. We've got the answers, we've got the solutions, and I think we can do things better, and I think that's why we're here today. And at my role as the CSA's Senior Advisor of Indigenous Engagement, which I've been at for 6 months, I'm getting to see the commitment that's here with OSC, see the commitment across the regions across Canada to really put in the effort to do things in a right way, to be more inclusive and make markets accessible to all. In specifics of the question, I think Clint is an expert in the area, and I've learned from past experiences that if you're in a spot where there's an expert there, take their advice and leave it to them to answer things like in that aspect. But there will definitely be tweaks and evolution of the document. So I think that as long as you're aware of that and it's a living document going to evolve, I think that is a good approach.
Absolutely is. Don't know if anyone wants to comment, or if maybe we could.
So I could jump
Yes,
in if we're
please.
still going in the
Yeah.
circle
Yes.
and for the dialogue. And I do also want to acknowledge Grandmother Peters. Thank you so much for your opening. And I guess just a few opening remarks. It is absolutely such a pleasure and an honor to be here with all of you and to have bared witness to some of this process as you've kicked off. And so first off, I feel like this is truly a special engagement, a special opportunity, and a special journey that your organization will be going through. A bit about me. When you did your opening, Jose, I was thinking about what I would say on my end. So I'm the national leader for the Indigenous Law program at BLG. I've been in that role since 2019, but I've been practicing since 2003. I am born and raised in downtown Toronto, but my background is Ojibwe on my mom's side and Mohawk on my father's side. So I've absolutely had that city experience growing up and living in downtown Toronto, but I was very fortunate to be able to every holiday go home, if you will, and that would be up at my grandparents on Manitoulin Island. So every holiday we would head home, and so I really felt like I got to see the differences between living in downtown Toronto and where my family was from on my mother's side. And I really feel that had such an incredible impact on me. So fast forward, I've been fortunate to be a lawyer for several years now. Not going to say 25 yet, but several years now, and have had an incredible journey and an incredible practice. I'm saying a lot of context here because I think it's relevant to the discussion that we're having today, so bear with me. But everything that I have been trying to do in my work has been all about addressing barriers. So, to see the OSC embarking on this journey and recognizing that, how can this plan address barriers to Indigenous participation in economic markets is absolutely the core of why I wake up every day, why I go to bed excited about tomorrow, right? It is the essence of all of this. And I think if you talk to experts and others who are doing all sorts of incredible work in the field, everybody has a different view on this topic because everybody comes to it in a different way. I can say to you, if I think about access to barriers, the first thing that really comes to mind for me, based on my own personal experience, is interacting with the Indian Act, right? And sort of thinking about this from a regulatory perspective. And that is centrally sort of what I've followed along in my practice. I think it's important for people to know that, I have a commercial practice now doing all sorts of work, working with Indigenous communities in the economic development space and trying to promote participation. But I really started at just this basic issue of how do we enable communities on First Nations lands to have their own economy, like to create sort of the basics, to establish themselves. There's transactions that I've been involved in where we were literally starting at the very beginning with Indigenous communities and realizing that my client had never borrowed money before. And, so you sort of roll back the clock, and this was a transaction in 2008, 2009. We had done the very first Indigenous-owned wind power project in Ontario. And I go back to these things, I mention them a lot, but they really truly are the essence of the issue, right? You have a chief and council that has never borrowed before, yet embarking on a multi-million-dollar purchase to build a renewable energy project to participate in the sector, to sell the energy to the independent electricity system operator. And quickly you start to see how all these pieces need to come together in order to establish markets. So I still like to go back to those original pieces in the beginning because I think those are still the major questions that we need to address and the questions and the discussions that we need to have. There's so much incredible work that's been done, and I want to acknowledge my friend Clint on screen for kicking us off in this question. I wish you were here. Wish I could see you, but maybe you were celebrating with all of Canada in the Jays game last night, or maybe you're just not here, so downtown Toronto. But I want to acknowledge your answer because I think you're acknowledging where we are now in so many ways. And as I think about the topic of addressing barriers, we really do have to go back to these original basic concepts of access to capital and being able to borrow, being able to leverage, being able to grant secured interest. These are still major issues that are not being addressed by our governments, and I think there's lots of ways that we can get there. But if we really talk about addressing barriers, I feel like we have to sort of understand those original challenges. But I really see, as I look at the documents that you've put together, just an incredible beginning to a process. And I agree with what Elder Peter was saying around starting with the truth. And I had sort of resourced one of my friends in advance of coming here and talking about this, and she had said the same thing, right? You really need to start with the truth piece before we continue on with the reconciliation part. And so, there's obviously lots of information that we're going to have to understand, and I just see this plan as a great start and a great opportunity, but so much to really understand. And I'll put it over to Carol Ann to continue on with the discussion.
Beautiful, thank you. Thank you, Elder Peters, for the beautiful opening and bringing to our awareness the importance of our ways as Indigenous people, and to bring awareness to the purpose and meaning that this specific space was created in. The space that we're in right now, if we reflect upon where the geographical markers are of where the lake is, where the mountain is, and the true orientation of the location and the design of this place, I think reflects another way of being present. It reflects another way of whole dimensions of meaning and experience. And I want to congratulate this organization in acknowledging the importance of that meaning and acknowledging the importance of that purpose and other ways of knowing, even from how we're sitting and what is placed and how the water and the circle here. And I recollect a conversation, I think this would have been about 2022, and I think Cullen was big high eyes going, we don't know what to do. And what a beautiful experience, one, to embody that as truth. How important that is of, that's okay. Nobody came knowing how to do this. And to be uncomfortable in that, there's a truth making, there's meaning making, there's the ability to look at other ways of knowing. So congratulations on staying in the truth of being uncomfortable, of where will this path lead us, and what are the conversations that we need to have, how do we need to lead, and how in that uncomfortableness is a place of growing. And to acknowledge the leadership that has brought this together becomes really important to understand that the shaping of meaning of why we're here in this particular moment, I think, has been shaped partly by one narrative that describes what has happened to us as Indigenous people. And there's a second narrative that we're powerful people. We're here because we defied the reality of what was prescribed to us within the Indian Act, and to realize that the Indian Act still refers to us as the Indians. And that's uncomfortable. If we were to take the existing plan that's in front of this institution and put Indians everywhere it says community, that's the contrast that we're existing in within this country. Think about it. Take this beautiful document that you've converged this reality that says the Indigenous relationship is important, and change that and put the Indians are important. The construct of the legal relationship of this country is funneled through the identity of the word Indian. And while there may be other experiences of modern governance, treaties, all types of historical constructs, the ability to reflect that pivotal point has established an entire economic domain that Indigenous peoples are powerful. So while there is truth and reconciliation, there is also that resilience. And in my work at the Indigenomics Institute, that is what we focus on, is a strength-based narrative of we are here as powerful agents of modern Indigenous economic design. And in being agents of powerful economic design, our ability to facilitate outcomes and to shift the dynamic of the economic table of this country, it becomes really important to reflect on the structures that we take for granted within how we describe what economy is. And all of those structures have been denied to us as Indigenous people. I'm struck by the leadership here in Ontario with the Robinson-Huron Treaty Settlement, where what was required to take into a Western construct of a legal testing, what was brought into visibility was the continued structure for the elimination of economic value and the future value for Indians through the historical Treaty of Canada itself. So the absence for the structure of value was perpetuated in the foundation of the development of this country. And it's in the perpetuation of the structure of the absence of value that I think your leadership as an institution to create the field of participation and to create the field of leadership, to stand in your own truth. We've stood in our truth as Indigenous people. For you as an institution to stand in your truth. It's in this moment that your ability to facilitate who is in your ecosystem and what influence is there in your ability, so that ecosystem of every single connection, every single relationship that you have, to demonstrate the accountability of what these results are. In my work at Indigenomics, I've finished writing my second book, The Rise of Indigenous Economic Power and the Deconstruction of Indian Act Economics. And the two parallel processes, what we are witnessing is the rise of Indigenous economic power. And that is also why we're here today. And in that deconstruction of Indian Act economics, that's also understanding how you look at that through this plan that you've created, to understand how and be able to name how that is deconstructing the experience of that over time is also an indicator of what success will look like. I think that in our work at Indigenomics, in creating Indigenomics on Bay Street as an event that brings into focus what is economic leadership in how we demonstrate our ability to stand in responsibility to the outcomes that are created, that stand in our ability to reflect on how well we communicate what the results are. And I think, lastly, that it's important to be able to describe these outcomes in the perspective of not only accountability, but in the economic measures, and to test the language and the assumptions in the document itself. To start with, to look at the word community, to understand and bring the language structure that has evolved and brings into the empowerment realm of Indigenous identity. So Indigenous recognition in the Constitution. How is that situated within, what does recognition mean? And to uphold that as a value of seeing the Indigenous person and the Indigenous community and Indigenous peoples. I think the implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, in what way is that activated within the document? And to look at the understanding of the activation of the language structures, the legal mechanisms of how we refer to the Indigenous relationship, all of those to test how language is used within the document, and as a starting point to understand the use of the word community and the use of the word nation, to understand the distinction of that and why that becomes important, because it's Indigenous nations that hold that recognition, and the evolution of language and how that has been brought to the specificity of this document. And I appreciated that it had the living element to the adaptation of what it needs to be, and how important that is, because it speaks to your flexibility as an institution of not being rigid, but also having the space and insight to advance to what it needs to be, and to have the eyes to see, the ears to hear, and the heart to truly experience what it is that you've heard here. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Caroline. Grandmother Dorothy, thank you. I'm sorry I have my back to you, but thank you very much for starting our day in such a good way. My name is Scott Monroe. I'm a member of the Kaska Nation, which is a broad region of territory that overlaps much of the Yukon, northern British Columbia, and a little bit of Northwest Territories. So I was born in Whitehorse, but I've grown up most of my life in southwestern BC, specifically the Vancouver area. After university, which I was fortunate to go to, of course, managed to go on and start my career in accounting, chartered professional accountant, and later in my career, when I was still in public practice, started realized the opportunity to start working more closely with First Nations in particular. And that's what attracted me ultimately to my role today, which is the Chief Executive Officer for the First Nations Financial Management Board. So I'm really pleased to be in this room to share a little bit of my perspective as a First Nations person, and also someone who works for a First Nations national organization. Maybe simply to be a little contrarian, I'll put out the argument that yes, that the plan does meaningfully address on paper the barriers, but I think it will need to go further, and there are items that are missing. By definition, there's no possibility that you would have the ability to capture or know what those barriers are yet. You might have some educated guesses, and in fact, you might have more than that based on the people you're working with already, but it's going to be a requirement that you seek out and look for the things that you didn't identify and will only learn about in your path forward. So yes, to answer the question, does the draft plan meaningfully address those some barriers? I mean, some barriers, yes, but like I said, there's going to be many that you're going to only learn about in time. So what's missing? I guess my only piece of advice, and I'll leave it at that, is that I just encourage those in the room to continue the hard work, to go out and consult, go out to community, go talk with knowledge keepers, go talk with those that are even outside of the traditional finance space, and really challenge yourself to listen to those and you might be surprised, in fact I know you will be, by the lessons and wisdom that you're going to get from those that you might think may not have much to offer. I would also encourage the OSC to consult with other Indigenous organizations. I'll speak to the ones I'm most familiar with, those being First Nation organizations. The one I work for, as I mentioned, the FMB, but also the First Nations Finance Authority that Clint mentioned. There's a First Nations Tax Commission, as well as a First Nations Lands Advisory Board. They, in their different ways, but together in many ways, are aligned on looking at those policy barriers. And those are some of the organizations, not all. There's many others I'm less familiar with, perhaps, but those ones really have insight, and they work day to day thinking about those barriers that many of which will affect or impede the financial markets and the work that the OSC has to do. So there's some intersection there with some of the policy work that's already been happening for decades, just maybe under the radar, that you might want to learn about. So I'll list a few just specific examples that I think have some relevance. There's right now a complete lack of any national insurance captive or reciprocal type entity to benefit or allow adequate and professionally managed self-insurance for community-owned infrastructure and other assets. So we just, First Nations have lacked the capacity or ability to and access to that type of market. So that's just an example, and that impedes so much economic development on reserve and in other areas. There's a complete absence or a lack of a modern and up-to-date land title system for First Nations and reserve land across the country, as well as land in the traditional territory. Again, if you can't manage your land base, how are you expected to benefit from it in a modern way? There's an inability to obtain surety bonding, so bonding of contractors on reserve. It's a huge impediment for activity on reserve. Again, it's not a well-known or well-understood maybe issue. But that's, again, back to the Indian Act that Carol-Ann spoke about so well, and the limitations in there. There's a lack, I believe, of access to development finance products and services that a new organization like a development bank, an Indigenous development bank, might be able to provide and offer. We have several development banks already in existence in Canada, but they don't serve the needs of Indigenous peoples. We have invested as a nation. The government of Canada has invested in other countries' development banks around the world for the purpose of developing their emerging economies. Well, we have an emerging economy here in Canada, so why aren't we deploying more resources to do something similar? And lastly, I think you should be aware of, if not finding ways to address or help advocate or support policy change at the federal government level. So there is an unwillingness right now, and this is a historical position, that the federal government, there's an unwillingness for the federal government to allow First Nation governments to securitize their annual capital asset funding that they receive through Indigenous Services Canada. And that prevents them from obtaining the necessary debt financing that some in this room would be happy to provide if they were able to do that. And that would accelerate the infrastructure gap or diminish that gap and accelerate the investment on reserve that's so badly needed. And it's just, having modern tools and approaches to that other governments have always had access to. So I raise those examples not necessarily as specific examples that the OSC needs to tackle. Some, perhaps there are logical tie-ins, but I think you need to be aware and informed of those structural barriers, because you might uncover some linkages to the mandate that you have as a regulator here in Ontario. So I'll pause there. I have some other comments to share, but maybe I'll pause there.
Well, I will just say thank you very much for all your very insightful comments, and you can be assured that we are taking notes, and we'll consider those. I will now pass it on to my colleague Nizam, who will bring us to our next question.
Yes, thank you very much. And there was the discussion started with humility, issues of humility, and I can tell you that just getting all this great feedback just tells us what a big challenge we have, and we've taken 3 years to get to the starting line. We don't want to take that long as we go forward. So what we're hearing obviously is that there are major structural obstacles and challenges that need to be addressed. But we also, and this has come up already in the conversation, we also need trust, inclusion, and relationship building. So I want to pivot to that, aspect of the action plan, and I'm going to start, Tom, with you, and then mine. I think if you can then join in the conversation. How can we build trusted, long-term relationships with Indigenous businesses, entrepreneurs, investors, policymakers, academics, thinkers, and really advance a real meaningful outcome out of our work?
I think that kind of pulling from previous points that have been put up here, I think that we have to realize that we're at the starting point where we have not an uneven ground that we're standing on in our seats. The government, being the government and being an economic institute, you have 2 strikes already against you, to use a baseball analogy. So I think it's extra important and it's imperative that you put extra effort into building those trusting relationships. You're already starting in a hole, so you have to bring yourself to level ground to be respected enough to and trusted enough to bring something valuable to the table. And so I think once that's realized, and I truly support what the OSC is doing here, because I can feel that that's supported from all executive levels and across the organization. And I think that's a start. You feel it within not only one representative from the company, but the whole organization, and that's important. So when it comes down to relationships and building successful relationships, these are things that our family, our grandmothers have taught us. There's based in those principles of respect and truth, authenticity, and I think once you base something and realize that these are foundational to building a relationship and look at it as such as that this is something that is a two-way street, and you're going to put in effort and expect effort to be put in. So it's a long road. And so another thing about timelines is you have to be realistic about timelines. Align your timelines and be realistic with the other side of the table. I remember I was speaking with a wise chief from Treaty 6, and he said, our relationship is that of 1,000 cups of coffee. And I was like, putting in context, it's like that's the time that's necessary to build that trust. We all know trust is something that's built. You can't come to the table with trust. You build that. And I really feel that if you're founded in that philosophy of here's what it takes to build a successful relationship in any business, in any life or anything, and you use those principles of sitting down and listening and learning, I think that you're on a roadway to success. And I've seen that, and I think that I've sat in with Cullen and we've sat with nations, and we've listened and we've learned. We've not gone there to be transactional about something. We've listened and sat down and in a way that was respectful and one which we came away with a lot of knowledge. And so approaching it right in those ways is imperative. So I think that's all I have to say about that right now.
Thank you, Tom. Maya, do you?
I think those are such great points, and a lot of what I'm thinking about it just will reflect what you've said. Right at the outset, I heard the comment around ecosystem development, and I love that concept. There's the what, and then there's the how. And it's really important that we honor both when developing reconciliation strategies. The what is the governance, the what is taking an enterprise-wide approach, the what is the tone from the top, and ensuring that as many business lines as possible, if not all business lines or business areas and functions, understand the role they play in delivering this strategy. It doesn't just sit with one person or one team. The enterprise or the organization as a whole needs to understand that the role that they play in delivering your action plan. But then the how, and the how is, to me, the more important piece, and it touches, moving from the transactional to the relational. It's rooted in trust, and I'm not surprised that the concept of trust and trust before reconciliation continues to come up in this circle, as it does all circles, because we think about it just in the most practical terms, and I always get concerned with reconciliation action plans, because how do you know what you're reconciliating for unless you know the truth. It's like, you know, fixing something, but you don't actually, you haven't acknowledged and you don't understand what's broken. And, you know, the OSC, I do want to congratulate you for this work, but also honoring truth and putting it in the forefront of your strategy. So how needs to be rooted in truth. There also needs to be, in my mind, that balance between urgency and patience. We, you know, and I know they're two terms that sort of go at odds with each other, but we can't sit back. This is such a powerful moment. And you know, we think about just today and right now and all of us gathered together. This has never happened in our history. And so we have to take advantage of that and we have to seize that. But we can't rush it either. And your point about timing and you know, in the financial industry, we report progress quarterly. Every 12 weeks, how are we doing? How are we doing in Q2 versus Q1? And it takes a very different mindset to honor relationship building, to prioritize relationship building, and to move at the pace of relationship building. And you know, this is not my quote, but I will share it. I don't know who owns it, but that reconciliation moves at the speed of trust, and trust takes time, and trust is rooted in that relationship piece. It's also really important around, you know, the how is that it is, of course, Indigenous led, and we've already heard that, and that needs to be, you know, fundamental, but there also needs to be representation of Indigenous and non-Indigenous voices because this is shared. And we look at the TRC and the three commissioners, two were Indigenous and one was non-Indigenous, and I think that that's a really powerful symbol of the collective accountability of all Canadians. You know, I have encountered in the past, and it's still an ongoing mentality that reconciliation is for Indigenous peoples or it's for non-Indigenous peoples. But the very definition of reconciling requires both sides coming together. And then, you know, I think that the last really critical piece to the how is around transparency and progress and reporting. And, you know, establishing those KPIs. And sometimes, you know, sometimes those KPIs are more, you know, they're storytelling. And so adapting how we report and what reporting looks like it may be required. It's not always going to be numbers. Oftentimes numbers don't tell the full story. But that is a critical piece in credibility and accountability towards what you have now publicly committed to.
I'm just going to, before I pass it over to Jose, I'm going to just see if Clint, you want to come into this conversation.
Yeah, I jumped into my answer without giving you a little bit of a background on who I am. So, you know, it's a topic that is a favorite of mine, which is myself. I'm just kidding. So I'm Inuk from Labrador, Nunatsiavut. We were the last Inuit land claim to be settled in Canada, which was in 2005. So Inuit stretching from the top of the Northwest Territories all the way down to southern Labrador, which include the top of Quebec. We've all settled our land claims. Not all are self-governing, but we've all settled our land claims. I was raised by my grandparents. I was born in Happy Valley Goose Bay, which I like to call the capital of Labrador. It was an isolated community when I grew up there, so there was no road access, fly in, fly out. And yeah, raised by my grandparents. My grandmother raised 9 children. She called me her 10th. And my grandfather was a hunter and a fisherman and a trapper. And so I was blessed with the opportunity of living in that sort of environment and to see that, to witness that, and experience it. And for that, I'm forever grateful. I also wanted to say, just really quickly, I'm not in Toronto today, unfortunately, but fortunately, my nephew is uh, being enrolled into the military as an officer, and he had invited me to attend the enrollment ceremony this afternoon in Ottawa. And I'm an honorary lieutenant colonel with the Queen's York Rangers, and so he thought it would be rather appropriate, and I'm very excited and proud of him. Um, in terms of the relationship piece, just really, really quickly, I thought Tom made a brilliant comment about not transactional. And, you know, Cherie and I, you know, we work extensively on transactions, right? And I know Cherie because she's a dear friend of mine, and when we look at this sort of, can't put words in your mouth, but when I look at this sort of stuff, and you know, Cedar Leaf Capital has been involved in two tremendous transactions with the First Nations Finance Authority, and as I'd mentioned, Stonlessic, representing 38 First Nations in BC. They're not another transaction to us, right? Like for some other investment dealers, maybe they are, you know, and for us, it isn't. And it's the consideration of why we are there, which is something much broader and bigger, which is to do what we can to break down those barriers in capital markets. And so I think the description around that as not being transactional, but trying to deeply understand and listen, as Tom said and Mayan said, I think is just absolutely critical to build that trust. The other piece, you know, it's better to do things and take the time to do it right rather than just doing it fast. And Mayan is bang on. We're always making comment, or we're always, you know, providing our results on a quarterly basis. You know, communities have to do that as well for their development corporations, their businesses, but you know, the relationship is a deeper piece than that, and it's not driven on quarterly results. The only other thing around this as well is, and I don't know if the OC is considering this, but I think you do need to have somebody on your staff who lives and breathes this. And I must say, this is the one thing, you know, I'm relatively new to when I first joined Scotiabank and then went over with Cedar Leaf. And I was just blown away by the fact that Scotiabank, you know, hired Mayan, and Mayan hired somebody who is specifically focused on truth and reconciliation. And I just thought, like, how cool is that to have an organization that does that? And so the worst thing, and I'd love to get, you know, hear Cherie's comments, but the worst thing I think you can do is to have a wonderful plan like this, but then have people doing it on the side of their desk because you're doing 8,000 other things. And, you know, I just think having that commitment and having somebody who lives and breathes this stuff, because I know all of us on the panel, we do that. And we bring that passion and authenticity, I think. I just think it would be extremely important. I know it's important to communities, and I would leave that with the OC for consideration. So, Nakumek.
So Sherry, do you?
I can jump in. Yeah, happy to. And thank you, Clint. You know what? This is such a good discussion. There's so many different things that people are saying that are really making me have so many thoughts. So first, your comment around the absence of value, I think is huge, right? And just quickly, you know, this is all a problem of the Crown's making, right? Like the fact that we don't have value on Indigenous lands, the fact that we can't secure interests is all of the Crown's making, right? The choice to seek to assimilate, the choice to, you know, advance colonial policies. This is all of the Crown's making. And so your point that we are still here is such a reality that we're all sort of moving towards. So I want to acknowledge that. What you're saying, Scott, around sort of all the systemic issues, like this is absolutely the task of the OSC. To the extent you have the bandwidth to consider these topics, this is absolutely the task, right? And getting into those issues is what will absolutely unlock interest, involvement, and a flurry of business activity that will build economies, that will be nation building. And sort of just quickly, Clint, like back to your comment on like this isn't just a transaction, is absolutely like it is central to our being. And so I absolutely agree with you on that. And that's why all of this can often be like very emotional, because we've been doing this work for so many years, and just to start to see the pieces come together is so incredible, and to see all the opportunity that can come about will just be truly transformational. On this question of building trust, I still think that you have to go back to understanding the problem, right? And I see like visually, and I think visually, but like I see our communities here and I see the OSC over here. Like we're not in the same places, right? Like where the communities are, what the communities are encountering. If I sort of think back living on Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte now for the past 3 years, like what I see in day to day, and the OSC is over here, right? Like what's gonna bridge those gaps is the real task, and there's not many people that understand what those issues are that can bridge those tasks. So it really still comes back to this fundamental topic around understanding the problem. So that's a lot of work, right? That's a lot of work. That's bringing in individuals who can see the issues from the Indigenous perspective. There are very few of us across the country. I mean, that is the essential issue as well, right? There's very few people that have been able to advance in their careers and professionally, and to sort of understand these issues, I think is the real challenge. But you have some people around the table today. I'm sure we'll continue to have more, but that's where you really need to pull back the onion and sort of see these challenges for where they're at. I want to quickly share a story about if I sort of reflected on where do First Nations and the Ontario Securities Commission interact? The first place where I saw that come into fruition was really on the Hydro One transaction, and sort of thinking about all First Nations in Ontario who were invited to make a purchase from the province of Ontario to acquire a piece of Hydro One, public company, issuer, the IPO, big IPO that everybody paid a lot of attention to. So many different ways to talk about this, but you look at the IPO and its importance around identifying issues and things that investors need to be aware of. And then you look at the transaction that we did, and then sort of where did the OSC come in, right? And it was around this whole question of accredited investor. But like these are massive leaps, right? So I'm not sure how we're all going to advance these topics, but I think it is by understanding where the barriers hit, right? And trying to see how do we address, how do we bring that Indigenous knowledge in? I think, Clint, you might have been talking a little bit about sort of the governance piece and how you can sort of have somebody that's able to speak to these topics. And this is absolutely central, right? To have somebody who could bring that tone from the top, like you were saying, Mayan, is critical because these are discussions that often happen behind closed doors. They need to happen behind closed doors because that's how you build knowledge and information and transfer and build confidence and trust. And I can speak to that personally, having done a lot of those behind closed doors discussions on boards of directors, and those are critical because these are difficult subjects, right? On how do we enable change in markets? I think we have to allow people to have private conversations with trusted advisors and the like.
José.
So perhaps we're almost at time and we're supposed to take a break. But maybe I can follow up with one question and whoever wants to jump in. So as we move forward on our journey toward truth and reconciliation, we know it won't be like a linear journey, and we may do face some setbacks and challenges. So do you have any advice on how we can keep our momentum and our relationship and trust building when we are facing some obstacles?
I'll just say, I mean, continue to work with humility, and I think you've demonstrated that in the work that's being done today. Don't be put off by setbacks. I mean, reflect on them, and take the time to understand how you got there or what led to that. But it's inevitable, right? It's inevitable that you're going to either disappoint people you're working with, or you'll make a misstep somehow. Mm-hmm. That's okay. Everyone is, you know, the people I work with understand that, and those that I've seen, those things can be overcome if it's just acknowledged, and you do that with an open mind, as we were taught this morning by Grandmother Dorothy, and you can move forward pretty quickly. So that would be my perspective.
Thank you so much, Caroline.
I think back a number of years ago, we give out annual Indigenomics Tend to Watch awards of just kind of up and coming, of particular note of what leadership in the Indigenous economy looks like. And that particular year, we had given one to the Toronto Stock Exchange, who had just finished their reconciliation action plan. Or no, they were pre-planned, but forming structures to advance that. And they're like, "Are you sure you're giving it to us?" Or like, everyone's gonna be looking at us, and we're gonna have to be responsible for our outcomes now. And we're like, "Are you sure?" We're like, yeah. Everybody is watching you. And it was this really beautiful place of discomfort in that. And I think, you know, for everyone that's like, we're in an AI world now, so you create your custom bot and you are this, and you create the direction. So you are a powerful agent of change. So you start with that as your beginning point, and to realize that language and the structure that you've created. So start with the assumption you're a powerful agent of change. And I wanted to bring that back to something that you were talking about in your opening comments. And I recognize the formidable leadership of the Financial Management Board, of the heavy lift of the institutional design of what was absent in this country. The First Nations Management Board has built this magnificent structure of accountability of Indigenous economic design. But what's important is that in this conversation, for you to assume the role that you are powerful agents of change, what we heard in this work was the formation of a development bank. So in saying that, if you are a powerful agent of change, First Nations Management Board has done years of institutional work and design. Come to the table and uphold the work, because it was just said what is needed most in this economy. You are a powerful agent of change. What has been described across thousands and thousands of voices and nations is the requirement for us to be successful. So instead of FMB knocking at the government's door, we need this, we need this, we need this, the activation of your leadership, I see this as a possibility of you as a powerful ally. It's been named, it's been validated that this is an essential pathway forward. Where's your leadership in that? So the challenge now is how to organize your leadership and the accountability for what has been readily described as a foundational need as a construct in the Indigenous economy right now.
Well, thank you for that. Another great area for us to consider and explore. And that brings us to our pause, our break of the morning. So you can have a very quick health break. And we will be back in, I would say we're supposed to be back at 10:40. So it's only like a 5-minute break. I'll try to keep us on time. But so thank you. We will be back at 10:40.
So thank you, everyone, for coming back from a very short break so quickly. I now want to shift into our second theme of this roundtable, which focuses on, with Grandmother Dorothy Peters' permission, Circle 5 of the OSC's draft action plan. This circle reflects on how Indigenous perspectives can be incorporated into our regulatory and policy work. As Cullen said earlier, this is where the rubber hits the road. We want to explore what meaningful engagement on regulatory and policy issue work looks like from your perspective. Specifically, how can we ensure that our approach to engagement on regulatory and policy matters is not performative or, as previously noted, as transactional, but rather fosters trust and mutual respect. So Caroline, I'm going to start with you, if that's okay. You have earlier diagnosed the problem of economic empowerment as largely a structural one, stemming from what you refer to as Indian economics. Sherry also referred to the same concept. And your proposed new model is based on economic inclusion, reconciliation, and empowerment. How do you see trust in relation with regulators fitting into that new model, and what role do you see for regulators within that?
It's a great question. I think that realizing that we have three distinct populations of Indigenous reality of First Nations, Métis and Inuit, and Clint, First Nations Inuit. But this prevailing concept that we talked about of this being of the government's making, and creating the leadership in the conversation of the pushback of the modern experience of that. How is that experienced? How is everyone within your ecosystem experience that? The more that we talk about this concept of Indian economics, the more pressure it builds of actual constructive design, because we know that was destructive design. So pushing in terms of the experience of the challenges that have been described, that is a conversation of your leadership as an institution to do that listening, not just from Indigenous peoples and businesses, but also to have that conversation with government and have the ability to be clear on what it is that you're seeing in what you know in that experience of, as an institution, how is that being reflected, what the rise of Indigenous economic power is? How are you seeing it? How are you aware of it? And that conversation from the government perspective, I think, becomes essential to look at a constructive design and look at the undoing of that destructive inheritance and the legacy that all of us have essentially inherited from that. That's a starting point. I think I'll finish there.
So, Tom, you've now been brought in by the Canadian Securities Administrators, so you're now going to be working with all the securities regulators. As you said, you've been with us for 6 months. Mm-hmm. How do you see the work you're doing and the plan that we're starting to develop at this the Canadian Securities Administrative level fit into what Caroline just said?
Yeah, I think that's, first off, me being here is a big step for the organization. I think any government does not move fast, and for knowing that there was such methodic and strategic thought that was put into me being here today and me being hired, I think that was the first step in saying, you know what, we need someone full-time dedicated to this, someone with an Indigenous background, to bring a perspective that was missing. And I think that shows a lot of savvy, that's the way that we're going to go forward. And I think that the CSA, working with the 13 commissions, has the huge responsibility of trying to harmonize between regions. And you can think of Canada as so vast, but I think if we align each other, each region is very much aligned, and I see that when talking to them, and they want action, they want to do something. And I commend the OSC for standing forth, putting a first foot forward and releasing an action plan. I don't know if that's going to happen regionally, but there is a lot of good work being put in across Canada at each commission level. And so for me to be involved in that and to see that will hopefully serve to share that knowledge between us and to disseminate that and to be able to put that knowledge to good work.
So, Jose and I are the only financial regulators here, actually. Scott, you're Vice Chair of Financial Services Regulator. Any thoughts from you in terms of, what has worked, not worked in bringing the Indigenous perspective into regulatory and policy matters?
What I've seen work quite well at the regulator I'm on the board of, as you mentioned, is being very deliberate about incorporating Indigenous perspectives and incorporating protocol beyond just a land acknowledgement, but thinking about what the purpose of a land acknowledgement is to bring you to reflect on where you're at in the moment. It's really meant to be a deliberate exercise, and it's not meant to be necessarily just reading something off a piece of paper or screen. So the practice that I saw that I quite like, and I actually see it as a best practice, I would encourage OSC to replicate it in other organizations. The responsibility for land acknowledgement is given to individual board members on a rotating basis. And the expectation is that something is brought back to the board and shared, something that is based on that individual's own research and own learning and own truth finding, no matter their background. And so it's ranged from everything from a reading of poetry, literally, to obviously some historical lessons that were unknown to the rest of the group. So it's beyond acknowledging the just the land or territory that we might happen to be meeting on. It's actually incorporating and building up the internal capacity of the organization in a way that's going to benefit everyone collectively. So it's thinking about sort of unique ways to make it your own way while still respecting the things that we know we should be doing internally. What other things have I seen that fosters trust and respect? I guess it's recognizing that while you might come with an agenda to a meeting, don't start with that. It's always important to start about asking what is the priorities of those that you're meeting with. What are the needs and priorities of the nation, of the community, and start there. Now, I realize that comes with great peril because you may not get to your agenda, and that's why it takes time. And you just have to be okay with that and understanding of that. It's okay to say, there are some matters we would like to bring into the conversation and discuss, but put the nation first, put the relationship first. And that will, I think, really pay dividends. My only other piece of advice, and I mentioned this already earlier, but I'll repeat it, get comfortable with getting out of the office and going north. With no disrespect to the communities that are adjacent and in the GTA and in southwestern Ontario, go north. We just hosted an economic conference in Timmins a few weeks ago that I was fortunate to be at. And we heard from elected and traditional leaders from communities including Atitibi, Anishinaabeg Nation, and Attawapiskat Nation. Just for the benefit of those in the room, their theme that they came up with for this conference is the North is open for business. So don't think that there is a lack of opportunity. There is a desire, a huge desire, but it's got to be on the right terms. It's got to be on, embracing the things we've talked about today. But if you do those things, boy, there's great opportunity in this province for investors, for businesses, if you go about it doing it the right way. And that's why I think it's so important that the OSC does this work so that you, in turn, can communicate the expectations to reporting issuers and to investors on how to do business. It is, like I said, you've heard it, I saw it firsthand. The North is open for business. As long as, I guess, asterisks, as long as it's done in a good way with some of the lessons we're learning today.
No, actually, we have with us here, our EVP of Strategic Regulation, Leslie Byberg, who's oversees the innovation investor office areas, and they do go out in the community. So, working this into those, when they do that, I think it would be really, really important, and we'll take note of that. Clint, as a market participant, how do you see, how securities regulators can better intake Indigenous perspectives on our regulatory and policy work?
So first of all, I love Scott's comments about go north and really get out of the office, be present, be there, see the communities, and so on. I actually like when you talk about, any sort of influence around policy, any influence on regulatory matters. First of all, I think there's a remarkable population of exceptional talent, of Indigenous lawyers. One sitting in the room right now who has such, I'm a reformed lawyer, by the way, who has, deep connection to community. Her perspective is widely respected. And she's one of so many incredibly dynamic and experienced lawyers who understand regulation, understand legislation, understand policy. The other piece that we haven't really talked about yet, and I think Caroline has alluded to it, and so when we talk about this relationship building, there is that exceptional body of talent on the entrepreneurial side too, right? And so we've only seen, I shouldn't say we've only seen, I'm only aware of, one or two Indigenous entities that have, listed on the stock exchange on the equity side. Nations Royalty is one of them, which was driven by Niska out of BC. Seems like some of the coolest things, man, they all come out of BC. It's astounding. That's the reason why I had to move to Vancouver after practicing law in St. John's, Newfoundland. But you have organizations like the Canadian Council for Indigenous Business. You have Raven Capital Partners. I was blessed to be on the investment committee. It's the only active Indigenous venture capital fund. They have such a deep network into the entrepreneurial ecosystem that exists. And when I was there, I was absolutely blown away by the number of entrepreneurs, A, how young they are, of course, and B, really focused on IT and tech. And it's only a matter of time that you're going to see, a couple of those businesses really start to scale up and really take off and probably issue an IPO on one of the stock exchanges. So I think even having relationships like that, getting that level of perspective as well, somebody who may be going through the process, I think that in and of itself will be helpful.
Shuri and Mayan, I'm going to come to you because I have a twist on the question for you. But Shuri, Clint has again passed the baton on to you, and
Sure.
and definitely lawyers are, capital markets are one of the constituents we speak to a lot, maybe too much, some would say. But we'd love to hear your perspective.
Sure. So I will just say my perspective is not as a securities lawyer, but I say that I'm okay with it because we have done so much work in the space enabling Indigenous communities, and I think there's so much that can be learned around the edges. So for myself, if I sort of think about the regulatory environment, think about early work that I've done, it was principally with the Ontario Energy Board. But that tribunal, when I was first involved in bringing matters forward, was just starting to consider whether the tribunal has a legal duty to consult. So how far have we, what an incredible way to sort of look back and see how far we've come. you know, it was like maybe 2008, 2009, the tribunal was like, do we really have to do this? Do we really have to figure that, you know, and then fast forward, we have Supreme Court of Canada decisions, and you know, now we're here with the Ontario Securities Commission with its own reconciliation action plan. So, you know, we've come an incredibly long way, so much more to do, but you know, there's a couple things that I want to make sure to share because I see this in sort of the work that I'm doing. We have, you know, when you have regulators consulting on plans such as this or other regulatory matters that you'll consider, and you're looking to go north and interact with communities and engage, there's really needs to be a separation or an understanding around the differences between consultation from a constitutional law perspective and consultation from what might be the province of Ontario's regulatory ambitions, right? And those can be two very different things. So, you know, encourage thinking about how do you get that information out on what type of consultation are we doing. And the simplest way that I like to explain it is capital C is like is section 35, and little c consultation is like all the other stuff that happens around the edges that's incredibly informative, but it's not going to put you in front of a judicial review in court in the same way. So I think you really have to sort out those pieces as you're moving forward with your initiatives. I still really, if I think about the regulatory environment and creating policy, you know, it's really trying to understand how First Nations are interacting with capital markets is critical. And you've heard about it in different ways around this roundtable today and lots of really good examples. But I think it really starts there in terms of understanding where the needs are. And I'm sorry, I'm going back to what Scott's saying because it was just such great comments. But, you know, really trying to understand how First Nations are interacting with the capital markets is critical. If I sort of look at the journey that First Nations and in the economic development space and sort of the growth of our markets, it's absolutely you know, it's been focused around the energy space, the infrastructure space, promoting participation. Some of that early access to capital actually came from the developers, right? Because the nations didn't have the funds to invest in projects and they were being consulted. And so, you know, you end up having proponents being the individuals that are the entities that would have to loan funds to First Nations to participate. So we're not in capital markets, but we're actually just getting into economic development, right? But that's been a huge experience. And then, so it's these proponent-based loans, unregulated, right? So, you know, we've got to connect the dots there. And then you see the connection with the federal government creating this policy around procurement and the 5% policy initiative. Also, incredibly market building, right? Economic development happening in all those areas, trying to seek out projects, all based around this procurement, this policy decision, and maybe people will have to, or I'll just quickly explain. But the government sets aside 5% of its annual procurement for projects that are majority Indigenous owned. And so, you know, then you get into all these definitions and the like. But that has created a whole nother market of all sorts of activities that are happening, again, unregulated activities where businesses and communities are forming businesses to partner together. And, you know, again, what a great opportunity, but also seeing so many pitfalls, right? Communities not having invested in these projects before, communities maybe not having access to legal counsel that can help them, communities not taking enough of embarking on a strong enough due diligence process to understand who they might be partnering with. Mm-hmm. So I'm sort of describing like my day-to-day practice in so many ways. And, you know, so there's like a ton of work in this space, but not regulated, right? But where will the need, you know, if you think about what could be helpful to Indigenous communities is trying to understand how do we bring transparency and accountability to those partnerships. So many, you would have seen articles in the paper in the last couple of years talking about partnerships that aren't truly representative of Indigenous businesses. I forget, there's the term rent a feather, but just this idea of not having Indigenous ownership truly reflected in the business. Huge problem, like huge challenge, huge concern for professionals and others trying to build economies. So to me, these are areas where the Ontario Securities Commission, in such an incredible leadership role, has an opportunity to try to understand how do we bring about more accountability into these structures. Where my mind goes to, and I, just brainstorming here, but like thinking about how do we standardize some of these arrangements. Like we cannot legislate investment, right? Like you cannot legislate capital investment. We cannot force, just for example, pension funds to invest in Canadian products, right? Like we can't force any of that stuff. We need to allow for markets to come together on their own, and the regulator has its own unique role. But we shouldn't be, we shouldn't have Indigenous communities be forced to reinvent the wheel every time they want to learn how to partner, every time they want to create a business. And Carolyn talking about entrepreneurs and all the work that they're doing. I would just love to see where we can standardize some of this work. I'd be happy not to do it. I'd be happy to not have my day-to-day occupied with putting together businesses, because there's so much other work to do, right? Like Clint is involved in this work now. Accessing capital markets, to me, that is a whole nother 25 years at least of incredible work, and so many wonderful entrants. Some of them work for Cedar Leaf, and I'm sure all sorts of other companies. We need to move. We need to be able to move to these other areas to build the businesses, and we shouldn't be stuck in the basics of like, can I partner with you? Are you a trusted partner? And I personally, my own personal reflection on this is I thought, sort of looking back, maybe this is sort of even looking back 10 years, I would have thought that we could have learned by not by example, but by doing. And I totally take your point. It's okay to fail. Like we absolutely have to do and fail, and that's how we learn. But I don't think we should force communities to learn the hard way, right? When we can come up with ideas and teach and bring knowledge. And so to me, this is the area where policy, like where the rubber can really hit the road, and we can make it easier for communities to participate, create some form of standardization. I'm not talking about creating like a Indigenous commercial code, right? We don't need to create specialized company, we don't need to create a completely separate area of governance, in my view. But we should look to enable these partnerships and just see how such an incredible role of the Ontario Securities Commission could play in that work.
So, fortunately, we have been, working very closely with our government, and some of his representatives, as are here, with us, and so it's really good to hear that this is, we need to have a broader base and a deeper one on which the capital markets work is done. So, definitely something to take back. I was just thinking that banks are bluntly the biggest players in in the Canadian financial system. Mm-hmm. They participate in every aspect of the capital markets, and I'm just wondering, as the work continues to be done at Scotia, whether it's possible we may start seeing Scotia reflecting some of the policy priorities of Indigenous businesses, through their advocacy and the work they do, as in the comments they provide to regulators in all the different interactions that we have with them. Maybe it's not something that can be answered today, but I'm just thinking that banks would be very powerful allies, considering the scope of their activities and influence across the financial system.
Yeah, that's a huge question.
Sorry.
And I think, and I also would welcome Clint's response to this, that strikes at a long-term, bigger than an opportunity, is a key goal, and particularly now that we have partners, the regulators such as yourself, emerging with reconciliation strategies, so that we can come together with a shared reconciliation objective. And but the piece around policy and Indigenous perspectives in shaping policy, I mean, it's not in the spirit of reconciliation if Indigenous perspectives are not driving and informing those policies. And I speak to, I know it's a diverse audience who has called in today, and hopefully it's all of your peers, but I know that it goes beyond that. And regardless of the industry that you represent or the company that you represent, diversity and perspective is really important. Something I think that can be overlooked is, and I think, Caroline, you touched on it, Scott, maybe it was you, about the distinctions of Métis, First Nation, Inuit perspectives, but also geographical. And we've touched on the North, and I've only spent a little bit of time in the North, but there is a significant divide between the North and the South that I think the South has created. There's also perspectives in gender and age and perspective. We think about Indigenous youth today and their perspectives, and I don't think there's anyone that is overlooked. But what is required in garnering those perspectives are the appropriate structures that start internally, and it starts with a team that is prioritizing Indigenous perspectives against whatever we are doing, including policy. But it has to go beyond that. There needs to be Indigenous representation at all levels of the organization to ensure that those perspectives are being captured. Another piece that we're working on is an external Indigenous Advisory Council. We won't be the first among FIs to stand one up, but that council will be critical to ensuring that Indigenous perspectives are prioritized and driving this work. And then the last piece is something that, just for one of the things that I think organizations struggle with in terms of supporting the reconciliation commitment is things that are tangible. And when we talk about a policy pieces, for example, they're intangible to a lot of teams and a lot of departments across an organization. And creating tangibility and relevance for no matter who the teams are, what they're accountable for, is really important. And that engagement piece, and it's been touched on a little bit, but creating opportunities between your organization and community where you're invited to do so, and you never go where you're not invited. But I think of powwows, for example, and sometimes we really focus on the big things, but some of the biggest things are actually those small community events where all are welcome, where the learning really happens, the engagement happens, the education, particularly for those from the organizations engaging with community and culture, starts to happen. And all of those micro actions start to facilitate that ecosystem that you touched on earlier, that culture, cultivating that culture of reconciliation that informs everything, including those policy pieces.
Thank you. Joseph, pass
So,
it back to you.
thank you for this. Maybe we'll continue this conversation, again, hearing the importance of partnership and trust, and knowing that it's going to take time. It's not just a one-time engagement. We are interested to know from a very practical level, how can we ensure that the OSC gets the Indigenous perspective built into our process in terms of really including the input in regulatory changes that we have. So I don't know if you do have some things that you'd like to see for us to consider, how we can really make sure it's a continual input and not just, I don't want to say transactional, but like focus on specific engagement initiatives, but more of a continual spectrum of engagement. So perhaps I can start with, I think I will start with you, Sherry. We talked about, because your background in governance and legal, we wanted to hear from you maybe to start this, answering this question.
Sure. So establishing partnership, I think I would, want to first talk about the journey that I had when I joined the Hydro One board. 2018, Hydro One was the entire board of directors exited the board, and a brand new board was created with the provincial government coming on into being elected. And so this was an incredible opportunity to join a major issuer at Hydro One, and just at a time when the company had just done, I think they had done their IPO in 2017, and we were the first-time directors around the board, and I was the Indigenous director, and there was already an incredible director on before me, an individual by the name of Roberta Jameson, somebody who is an absolute mentor to me. But, if we sort of think about the concepts of building partnership and the opportunity to have joined a public company board back in, not too many years ago, I guess about 8 years ago now. A real objective for the company to think about how could it fulfill its objectives and mandates would be how it could build trust and regain the trust among Indigenous communities that had been lost. And you sort of look at the old historical grievances and issues that the company was facing, and sort of the incredible opportunity to be around that boardroom table is something that we would really want to encourage other public companies, other issuers to consider bringing in that Indigenous knowledge. I absolutely, if I sort of look back to the work that we were doing, there was very little knowledge around the boardroom table about the impacts that the company had had historically across Ontario. And sort of you look to the history of Hydro One and its predecessor, Ontario Hydro, and sort of all of those impacts, you really need to focus on building that knowledge and that understanding around the boardroom table, establishing that tone at the top. And I really credit the ability to have those private conversations at the boardroom table with the company being able to advance such an incredible policy objective that I feel, sort of looking now, has had such an incredible impact in the market. So you really want to think about how to build partnership and trust, and think about how to be creative and, revolutionary, even in the sense of what, we did at Hydro One, to enable 50-50 partnerships on all projects where the investments were over $100 million. That can only happen when you have Indigenous voices at the company level in the governance of the organization. And so that's really what I obviously promote. And then having been appointed to the board of TD Bank in 2021, completely different history, but such an incredible opportunity. So you talk about all the work that Scotiabank is doing, and credit all of that work, and not an easy journey to think about how you bring more involvement of Indigenous people, whether it's retail, commercial, capital markets. All of that work is going to take so many hands, so many eyes, so many creative ideas to be brought forward.
Great, thank you for that. Maybe I'll turn to Scott. Your perspectives informed by deep integration in policy development from your CEO role. How can we ensure, again, that we get that perspective built through our consultation process, whether it's regulatory change or other initiatives. How do we make sure that we can capitalize on that input and expertise?
Yeah, no, Jose, great question. I guess a few pieces of advice for you and your colleagues. First, and I think it's already started, develop a network of Indigenous peoples that are in this space. It's not a big community, I accept, and sometimes it can be hard to get their time and attention, but continue to grow that network and tap into it. And I think that's already started today. I would encourage you to go beyond the more traditional business community. Like, think about the academic community. There's a lot of amazing Indigenous people in the academic community that, again, can probably bring a really informed perspective that will complement anything that you'll get from those that are maybe working in finance directly. I happen to work with two colleagues that are either completing or have finished their PhD in various subjects. So there's some amazing people out there. And so tap into the academic community and the universities to find those individuals to join that network. I would encourage you to also develop relationships specifically with the business enterprises that First Nations in particular are now operating. We call them government business enterprises in the accounting profession, but commonly referred to as economic development corporations or similar. And there's a whole cadre of business leaders now that, again, aren't necessarily high profile, and they're not necessarily on Bay Street. Again, they're going to be maybe operating businesses at different scales in different parts of the country and in the province. But that's probably a great place to go and look for input, because you'll get practical direction. And you won't get you'll get some straight talk from folks that are doing that type of work for the community and in the business sense. My other piece of advice is consider reaching out and working with other regulators, other professional bodies, and standard setters to coordinate the work that's being done, because it strikes me that there's a lot of shared objectives in this space. I don't think anything that is being done is meant to be proprietary here, and I think it's really great to share what's working and what challenges. And again, it will reduce kind of the expectations and the draw on your people that are advising these respective bodies. So there's some synergies, I'm certain, if you were to talk with obviously your counterparts in other jurisdictions, but also other professional bodies such as CPA Canada here in Toronto. And other standard setters. The organization I work for, the First Nations Financial Management Board, is helping and playing a leading role in forming what we're calling a national Indigenous Economic Council. It's new, and we're still trying to decide if it's going to be a sort of a forum of business leaders or policy thinkers, Indigenous policy thinkers. So it's still in the formative stage, but stay tuned. That would be something I would encourage you to come back and see if that's a body that in time could become a source for these perspectives. And the Indigenous Economic Council is meant to be comprised of representatives from a whole variety of national Indigenous organizations. So it's meant to be very inclusive. So, like I said, time will tell how formal that organization becomes, but we're hopeful. I guess lastly, I would just continue the work to make sure you're listening to your Indigenous employees and those that are entering the workforce, especially our youth. The more success that you have in attracting Indigenous youth to the as an employer, and also those that are working for other organizations that you work with, I think that's another hidden source that could pay great dividend. So those are a few ideas.
Thank you for sharing these great additional ideas. We could go around the circle here and see maybe Tom?
A tidbit that I've been playing around with and I've been throwing, like we talk a lot about Indigenous perspective. And one word that I've kind of been substituting in, which gives me, I don't know whether it broadens my thoughts a little bit, was instead of perspective, how about Indigenous expertise? Say, how can I adapt instead of have an Indigenous perspective? How about adapting some Indigenous expertise? And that kind of makes my mind work in a different way, and I like it. So that's just one little tidbit that I had that I wanted to share on that.
That's a very good point.
I'm 100% in agreement with what you were saying in terms of governance. What's at board table is the leadership that is reflected in building the outcomes. I think the accountability to report the outcomes of the strategy to the board and maintaining that builds a culture across the institution and continuously evolves the perspective of what is next and what is the strength of the outcomes that are created, and builds that cultural organizational response to what leadership is, and building the ability to create an active response, I think starts at the board table. That would be, I 100% agree with that perspective.
Thank you. Nizam, do you want to ask the next question? Or
we are done with the questions we had, and so we've offered you to ask an audience question. And the question is, as the OSC practices reciprocity and wants to learn in a meaningful way to build out the reconciliation action plan, how can our communities and business leaders similarly learn from you and access your knowledge, transfer and build practices, strengthen capacity to navigate access to the capital markets? So what I would say is that I think the OSC should not be presumptuous, that we understand what the needs are and how to, and what we can bring to that. I think we should have a conversation, hearing from from the Indigenous communities what it is that we can bring to the table. So I'd like to throw this question over to see. Maybe I'll start with Clint, because you're virtual, so I want to make sure you get to be involved as we come close to the end. What your thoughts are in terms of what the securities regulators and other regulators can bring to the table that would result in strengthening Indigenous communities from a financial perspective.
Well, hands down, it's your deep knowledge and expertise on obviously the regulation of markets itself, right? And so the work that you do, I would imagine, and again, I'm not speaking on behalf of all communities, but I like Cherie's sort of visual of, you have the OSC over here and you have communities over here. And so, Scott was right. Many of our businesses are not necessarily on Bay Street. And so it's so far removed from the community reality, right? But it doesn't have to be. And so I think, I think there's huge value that you can bring to open the eyes of so many Indigenous business leaders within communities and community leaders as well, in terms of what's possible to participate in the market. And I also like what Scott said too, like, don't do this in isolation, right? Like, not everything has to fall on your shoulders so you know the answers to everything. There are other organizations now that are actively trying to do what they can to establish those bridges and connections with community. One of the things that, and it's not necessarily regulation, but one of the things that we've done at Cedar Leaf, which I thought was quite exciting, is to do a little bit of a learning session with capital markets participants on the reality of Indigenous activity as it pertains to capital markets, but starting with a baseline of sort of facts, which would include some historical facts and so on. In particular, what I love is the maps of Canada, right? So you look at the map of Canada where you look at historical treaties, and you also look at the map of Canada where you see modern treaties. We did this with a rating agency, which will play a very important role in terms of working with communities and understanding what their role is to make access to capital markets in affordable way, in a very affordable way. We did this with institutional asset managers, and we have a plan for another regulator as well. And I think it's just trying to kind of provide that perspective, and to really, I mean, many of these organizations already have kind of online learning, which again is very important. We just wanted to supplement that as well with more knowledge around capital markets. So I actually think you bring a lot to the table, and it's just trying to determine whether or not you can collaborate with other organizations, or maybe host different learning sessions or something, and piggybacking on a variety of different gatherings, conferences, Indigenomics on Bay Street, etc., that exist, and you'll have ready access to some of those Indigenous business leaders right off the bat.
So, Tom, just building on what Clint has said, and the engagement work that you're also doing for us, how do you see this exchange? What really sounds to me like what we're really talking about is an exchange of ideas, expertise, information, so we can all work together to move this all forward.
So I think that what I hear from everyone is we're willing to share information, and I want to bring that to the CSA and OSC. Like, I want that attitude of, let's not keep what we learn to ourselves, let's share it. And I think that if I can make it such that we can share things within the CSA and the regions, well, there should be an opportunity to share outwardly and to share with other communities, other businesses, and because this is a lot of work, and our efforts can be strengthened by gathering our knowledge together and being like, this is what we bring forward. So that's what I would bring forward for sharing knowledge.
Anyone else?
Maybe on that point, on sharing knowledge, but share success as well. I mean, you have an opportunity to actually encourage the sharing and even facilitate maybe the sharing of success stories. So I'm thinking of ways to encourage regulated entities to voluntarily share with you, how has the actions being taken helped their business? How have opportunities been taken advantage of, or how has prosperity, in whatever form it takes, occurred as a result, or maybe as a direct result of taking specific actions that are called for under the TRC calls to action, for example. So facilitating that, because success builds success, right? And if more businesses see those that have adopted early, seeing it pay off, is not then seen as just a cost. It's actually, there's real reward and ROI attached to doing these things. So I think the OSC, I think there's something that could be done to foster that information sharing, that success, and those stories.
One of the things to that point specifically that we have been really thoughtful about are Scotiabank is using our very powerful and far-reaching communication channels. And to whatever extent that you have access to communication channels, whether it's through your social network or beyond, is to use those channels to influence your peers, to talk about the honest history of this country, to talk about the risks of doing nothing, to talk about the business benefit and the business benefit for all. That please don't ever underestimate the influence of your voice and the built-in channels that you have that a lot of organizations don't.
That's great. I mean, I think I really just want to reinforce some of the points that were already shared, but there are absolutely organizations that understand the problems that we're trying to fix, right? And I think you're saying that, Scott. I mean, I think aligning with other organizations would absolutely give you some insight around topics on thought leadership that are needed to be addressed. And as you sort of think about how to embark on these questions, I mean, we don't necessarily have to have the answers, right? We need to create the dialogues, and collectively we're going to get to these really tough, answering these really tough questions. But so I absolutely think there's a knowledge transfer that can happen. There's some thought leadership that the Ontario Securities Commission could be taking a lead on. But ultimately, we really want to build confidence in the market so that we can get to this next milestone. And I didn't get to mention it, but I'm sure Clint thinks about it too. But where we have more First Nations having the confidence to invest in business activity that's happening across the country, right? Historically, communities have been so, I guess, uncertain about how to make these financial decisions, but we ultimately have to figure out how to build confidence in those investments and to have Indigenous communities with confidence investing in businesses and earning returns, and like that to me is the next mantra that we have to get to, and that's absolutely, I think, within the wheelhouse of the OSC to help build that confidence and knowledge to make investments, and then have the protection of the Securities Commission to ensure that those are investments that are reliable and build trust.
Excellent.
So as we're now getting closer to the end of our time together, thank you for all those really insightful comments on the two circles. Just a quick, couple of quick observations. Clearly, it's always our engagement should ensure not only that we are hearing the voices, but there's actual regulatory impact of what we are hearing, and even broader use of our influence and advocacy, where it would be helpful and make sense. Embedding Indigenous perspectives in our policy work, it's clear that all of this will not be done overnight. And the advice that, don't make it a box-ticking exercise, essentially. Really make sure this moves slowly, but with urgency on the most important things. And while you're understanding and building relationships is really important. So as we now move, we want to hear, as we come to the end, your sort of final insights on our action plan. And I'm going to sort of provide an area in which we would definitely like to hear from you, but please feel free to go broader, just be 2-3 minutes each as we get towards the end. Mine, you already, started talking about this, which is, how can we, from your personal experience and perspectives, how can we determine what success for the OSC would look like as we embark on this journey? How should we measure and report on progress in a way that is transparent, accountable, and I heard a really good point earlier, outcome oriented. I think, not just measuring, things you've done, but how is it actually making a difference is something obviously we are hearing today also. So Mayan, I'll start with you, and then we'll just go around the circle.
Well, listen, I mean, this is all trailblazing work, and we all have an idea of what those ultimate outcomes are, but they're really unique and specific to the organizations that we're representing and guiding this work for. But I do just want to take a moment to acknowledge that this is the 10th anniversary of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's final report and calls to action. And Sinclair, Littlechild, Wilson, they gifted this nation the most incredible roadmap. I mean, it's one of the greatest gifts that Canada has ever received. And, Marie Wilson, one of the commissioners recently, we did a podcast with her recently, and she talked about on this very hard and long journey to make sure we take a moment to celebrate the wins. And I just, piece of advice for you that have been gifted to me from her is the importance of acknowledging those wins and those, this is the work. This is a million little steps to where we want to go, and it's okay if we don't fully have a clear and defined and acute vision of that. But on that journey, and it's one piece that I'm starting to think about a lot now that I've had a full year since we launched our action plan, is what are the risks to progress? and it's the last piece that I'd like to gift to you as you prepare to officially formally launch this, is to start to think about what those key risks are. And the ones that we've identified are continuity in teams. All of our work was birthed within business areas and functions, but what happens is those leaders move on to other roles or to other organizations. That knowledge leaves. The insight, the wisdom, the mind knowledge, the heart knowledge, it all goes. And that's a big risk. As we learn and grow, and as these mandates expand, the knowledge, the skills required also changes. And so making sure that you keep pace with the evolution, the momentum that will start to happen with your action plan is key. And making sure next is that it is well resourced. You have made a public promise, and there is no quicker path to failure than not putting resources behind those promises. And lastly, to ensure that those who are leading this work on the inside, and hopefully they are Indigenous leaders leading this work, that they are cared for, that the wellness of those internal Indigenous leaders are a priority. This is very personal work. It is not work that leaders turn off at the end of their workday. It is always on their shoulders, and awareness and respect of that is really key as you move forward on your journey.
Thank you. Tom?
I think the success, you have action items, you have timelines, and sure, you have successes. We met those, we did that in that time, but I think what you'll see is those aren't the successes. Really, it's those outside things that you didn't account for that you'll find success in. The influence that you can bring beyond OSC's realms, outside of Ontario's borders, you'll start to see that. To me, sounds like success, and I think that's where you'll see is that as you move down your action items and you check them off, you're creating so much more, and the influence and the chance to learn from this and for others to learn from this, I think the opportunity is great, and I appreciate being involved.
Thank you. I would just add, I really take your points, Maya, that you're sharing. You will run out of people to work with, in the sense that everybody is doing all sorts of other initiatives, and it's very difficult to have time to be available for this type of work. So I really see that the only way you can succeed is through collaboration, right? We've talked about it a lot, but that, in a sense, joining arms, going arm in arm and doing this work together creates more energy, excitement, and learning. So I think you really have to figure out how to get out of your own shell and collaborate with other organizations. And, really to reinforce this idea of, there may be things that the OSC could think about lending its support. You are so connected to the province of Ontario. You're a phone call away in many ways. There's discussions that can be had where you can lend your support to initiatives that are so critical for Indigenous communities, and think broadly about your mandate from reconciliation, because you talked about going a little bit more broad. So I would challenge you to see where those wins can be, where you lend your leadership and your support into other initiatives that communities are embarking on. Often it's really just a few phone calls that can get to untapping solutions that have been major barriers for communities. And a lot of these solutions come from having individuals in the right place at the right time to be able to affect change. So you are at an incredible place, an incredible position of leadership. So my final thought is to use that leadership role that you have to help bring about solutions, and really look forward to seeing what will happen.
Thank you. I see that you have first mover advantage in this space, in this particular structure. and to really bring that into focus of what that means. And I will guarantee you, everyone is watching you. It is a highly visible undertaking. And in that, I would really recommend be generous with the knowledge that you're creating. Invite others into the space of what it is that you're learning, and host the conversation. How many other regional groups are there? And to just, this is the different, it doesn't mean you've got it figured out. It means that you're willing to have the conversation. And being generous with the knowledge that you're creating in this space is really important. And telling the story of, there's an economic empowerment that happens in the unfolding of these outcomes with nations, but there's also an economic empowerment that happens with you. And to realize what is being activated in this space and the outcomes, and to tell the story of this moment becomes really important, as this, it never fails me to realize, the work of the commissioners in building that call to action was built on thousands and thousands and thousands of experiences of Indigenous children, and the truths of that, to how that's carried, that this is an outcome of that experience, and to carry that with wisdom and with leadership and humility and generosity. And that's really some of those core values of an Indigenous worldview, and to realize the importance of carrying those values in your work. Thank you.
It makes me think the amount of time it takes you to get out of a hole depends on the depth of the hole, and this is a deep one. So Scott.
Yeah, thank you, Nazem. Before I fail to think of it, and I'm sure I speak for my colleagues, I want to thank you and Jose and others in the room for creating this safe space for us each to share our perspectives. I guess my final remarks, my final real piece of advice is summed up in the words of a member of the Squamish Nation who I really respect. His name is Brad Baker. Brad is an educator. He's gone on to advise the provincial government on ways that the curriculum in my province can be more inclusive, and I've seen the effect his work has had in the school system with my kids. His tagline that he ends a lot of his presentations with is simple: go forward with courage. And if you really embrace that, you're not going to get anything wrong, because courage, there's so many elements to that. So, when you're looking for, or if you're uncertain, think of those words, I guess, on how to act, because I think that will be respected. I would encourage the OSC to continue to report on its progress. I would love to see, an annual check-in on the goals, and don't be afraid to share your failings or where you haven't made the progress you had hoped. There's nothing wrong with that. It's not failure. It just means future progress to be made. So, just be candid with your audience, and they'll appreciate that. I would, you could incorporate that separate report by reference in your annual report. I think that would be a nice way of also getting it into the broader document that maybe more people will read. Success, I believe, would be seeing a change in the actions and behavior of those that you regulate. So think about, what are those end points that you're really looking to see in the marketplace. Yes, it's all great work that internally needs to happen, but ultimately you're there to help shape the behavior by capital market participants. And so it's really think about what, maybe that's the next evolution of the document, thinking about some of those specific behaviors and creating platforms for those successes and behaviors to be reported, disclosed, unshared, because again, success builds success. I would love to see reporting issuers in particular adopting and incorporating the very free advice and the best practices that organizations like the First Nations Major Projects Coalition, continue to publish online and communicate so well at their annual conference. So there's just such an easy way to tap into some of the best practices that Indigenous peoples are saying are going to work for them. Yeah, and lastly, I guess success in the future would, for me anyways, include ensuring that the many professional advisors, the assurance providers that are working for investors and reporting issuers, that they're also compelled to start considering the factors that you've raised as well. So as Carol Ann said, yeah, you have the advantage of being first, so use that. Like, that's a huge opportunity to shine the light elsewhere and say, join us on this journey, and gently encourage and apply gentle pressure, I guess, where it's needed to continue seeing others respond in similar ways. So that's it for me, and I really appreciate the time.
So Clint, we're going to close the circle. You started our panel conversation today. We are going to end with you and your thoughts, final thoughts.
I guess just a couple of things. So first of all, and you've heard it time and time again, this takes time, right? So I strongly encourage you not to be discouraged if things kind of go sideways a little bit or there's bumps in the roads and so on. I hearken back to the exceptional words of the Honorable Stephen Point, who is a remarkable Indigenous leader and former LG, Lieutenant Governor of BC. He actually said these words when I was at the Native Pre-Law program in Saskatoon, and he said, having government complain about where Indigenous communities are at in terms of governance or economic capacity and so on is akin to breaking a man's leg and then complaining that he has a limp, right? And so, as Cherie said, this is of the Crown's making. This is going to take time, and I would strongly encourage you not to be discouraged. The other thing is, I would love to see, and I think it has to be, this commitment must be a part of the DNA of the OSC. This cannot go under attack and be shelved, similar to what we've seen with diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, particularly in the United States. This has to be reflective in the values. Every organization has a mission, vision, values. This commitment to reconciliation, however way you want to describe it, has to be reflected in the values of the OSC so that it is cemented into the DNA of the organization, and it's not attributable to one or two individuals within the organization, but it's there for not only current employees, but for future employees as well. And by doing that, so you influence your own behavior, but as well, as Scott said, I think it would be better position you to think about how you'll be influencing the behavior of other market participants. So with that, I want to say Nakumik, and it was a real honor to participate today, and congratulations on your success to date with all eyes on you. So Nakumik.
Thank you, Clint. I think it's a perfect way now for me to ask our OSC board chair, Kevin Cowan, who has been a strong supporter of this work, together with our board and obviously our CEO, Grant Vingo, to provide the closing remarks on behalf of the OSC.
Great, thank you, Nizam. And I'm Kevin Cowan, chair of the board of the Ontario Securities Commission. I want to just start by saying what an absolute privilege it is to be here today and to have input from all of you, and I'm looking at you as well, Clint. But also just to be in this room, this magnificent room that I didn't know this morning existed in Toronto, and I think is now one of my favorite places in Toronto. So absolutely magnificent. Lots of themes today, and the ones that jumped out at me were truth, trust, community, collaboration, reflection. And one word didn't come up today, but I think it's been underlying everything that's said, which is patience. Right back to Clint's most recent comment. So let me just deliver a few messages on behalf of all of my colleagues at the Ontario Securities Commission. And let me start with gratitude and thanks. So I really want to thank everyone on the panel for being here today. Looking at you as well, Clint, and everyone here. Thank you for your wisdom, insights, your generosity with your thinking and with your time. You have challenged us to think deeply, listen more carefully, and act with some courage. So I appreciate that. To our audience out there, thank you for joining us today and for your thoughtful questions and your willingness to engage in these very, very important conversations. Very special thanks to the Aboriginal Legal Services team, whose guidance and support were essential to shaping this event. And of course, to Grandmother Dorothy for her thoughtful and grounding opening that reminded us of the spirit in which we do this work. And I really particularly enjoyed the opening as you went around the room. And I've heard of that process before, but I've never had the privilege to be part of it. So thank you very much. I want to thank the OSC team who've worked so hard to bring this event together. Your care and commitment have created a space where the feedback on our action plan for truth and reconciliation could be both shared and heard. Now just to move to one of the other themes, ongoing process. And we did hear today that this is not just reflection, but it's guidance. And it reminds us that reconciliation is not a single conversation and not just a symbolic gesture, but it is an ongoing process, requires sustained effort, humility, and concrete action. Particularly around the reinforcement of pillars 4 and 5 of our action plan for truth and reconciliation. The insights shared today reinforce the importance of two key aspects of that draft Truth and Reconciliation Plan. The first is engagement with Indigenous communities. Reconciliation requires relationships built on respect and trust, and we heard that in spades today. And I really want to say the several references to not being transactional and really being about community and relationships and trust resonated with me. And of course, the importance of the spirit of partnership where dialogue is ongoing and Indigenous peoples help shape not only the questions we ask, but also the solutions that we pursue. The second aspect of that, of course, is the actual incorporation of Indigenous perspectives into how we approach both our policy and our regulatory work. And I see this, of course, as applying both to how we carry on business internally within our own halls and then how we carry out our policy mandate more broadly. Our responsibility is not only to listen, but to help ensure that what we hear informs how we develop rules, assess impacts, and hold ourselves accountable. Embedding Indigenous views, values, and lived experiences into policy developments supports the goal of avoiding old patterns of exclusion and instead reflects a more inclusive and equitable foundation. This does require us to strengthen our capacity to understand Indigenous traditions, governance systems, and economic realities. Accountability. Accountability is key, and reconciliation cannot be a promise without proof. We must be clear about our commitments and transparent on how we progress. It means setting goals, tracking progress, and reporting back in ways that are honest and accessible. And as Nizam pointed out, it's not just about tracking inputs or activity, but also outcomes. And it's all, of course, about relationships and showing Indigenous communities and stakeholders that we are listening, learning, and adapting as we go. A living commitment. It is a living commitment. We know reconciliation cannot be reduced to a checklist and is not just on a similar theme, a box to be ticked. Ongoing attention, adaptation, and willing courage. So next steps in conclusion, the next step is very clear. We will take the feedback today, which is invaluable, from this roundtable, along from input with other engagements, and use it to refine and strengthen our draft action plan. We will be sending a short survey to all attendees as we greatly value your feedback, recognize that it's integral to the process, and want to use it to help shape future roundtables. Together, hopefully, we can move from words to action, from plans to practice, and from intentions to lasting change. I will now turn things back over to Grandmother Dorothy Peters.
So bonjour everyone again. Good afternoon. Just want to just close in a good way, but I just wanted to say a few words in terms of just listening to all the conversations that were going on. It's really important that you uphold community because that's what we do. You have to earn the trust of community, but you also have to uphold community after. And so I heard that trust, building relationships, and caring, but also I think it's important to validate the knowledge that you'll be receiving from First Nations. So once you can do that, because that's what we need, validation in church, in terms of just talking about our realities and our truths. And once you can do that, then you take accountability for where you stand. Because what you're trying to say is you want to make things work. And so trust is an important part, like in any relationship. And when you break that over and over again, it becomes harder to build anything, because then the other party is going to go look somewhere else because you can't be trusted. And so that's why I say uphold your community and make sure that you're a good leader, because all eyes are on you, like somebody was saying. So now people are watching you. You're taking that step to do something, and you voiced it. And so as part of a community, we'll say, okay, here it is. And so there's a lot of information out there, a lot of TRCs, commitments that people have made. So there are different places on their journey, and so you just need to reach out for them. You don't need to reinvent things. So when you talk about partnerships and working with others, that's where you can reach out and talk to other people, see what didn't work, what works, but always keep in mind the journey that you're on and the responsibility that you have, and to be accountable and to come from that place of truth for yourself as an individual. Are you walking that way? Because if you are, you're going to go places, and you never have to worry that things are not going to work out. And that's how we pick our leaders. And then that's how our leaders know that they're doing what they're supposed to do. And so just wanted to say that, and I just want to acknowledge all of you for your input, and I really learned a lot, tried to think about it and translate it in the language, and so you're all doing good work. And again, it's not, don't just pick a person in the company to do all the work and then everybody does their own work. It's too much for one person. Create a space like this, a room, because we still need to bring in spirit. We still need to bring in our medicines. And we still need to have a space where we can be comfortable and to have those conversations, to sort out things, because you're going to encounter that, to sort out things. And so you need a space for that. That's a reflection of the work that you're doing. So in saying that, I really wish you well, and I hope that you do what you say you're going to do. And so I'm going to close now in a good way and ask our ancestors have heard you, what you said. And so I'm going to send them home now, and And so, Bojo, Chimanito, Bojo no Komisag, Bojo Mishomsag, Bojo Daema Ganag, Megoch Sago Bemouch Sang Nogum, or Nichagagi get on going to gate bis in the mouth. Garnish me work I should say me, or Nigi Canin Dil Galwia, or Nigi Nanagatine the Mog, I didn't work quite knock on the gale, or Nichamos the Mikana, or Nigi no Chibmat Dwat Sago, Chich out no time Aganel. Kani nimsa ko makina gana mat tabiat gana shmiu gege kage o nigi kage geto go nigi pisid natiog mita shigogek wicho aningo kwa shichigeot an mi iwe nungum kinasa ko magi tibach mota tiot o nigi no chinana gata damata ningo kwa nakunigeot o nigi no chibmoseot mi e mikana job and damat sagogego Migoch can snabem skikion kinasigo gab me totoya. Kinagi gab jito me marking any be. Kana shigi shine me ganan me work chimanito. Kinagi go get me go me no chipmat to sing. Meet the sheer, shine mishnam, gane mishnam besenda shinam aha. Me goich. So I just thank the grandmothers, grandfathers, and the Creator and our helpers for coming to visit with us and just help and support the conversation today. Just acknowledge the medicines that we use and carry. All the gifts and resources we get from the lands and the waters. We're grateful and thankful for the ones that we use every day. Just thank all of you again for all the knowledge that you shared. And also just to continue to support and guide and help each other to listen with your heart and also keep an open mind. And also just to, you're not always going to agree. That's why we sit in circles. And I think that's why I was mentioning that, because your conversations are going to go round and round, but you'll come to an understanding. And sometimes that's all you need to move forward. You don't have all the answers. None of us do. And so, say Megwich for that, and just thank everybody again for coming, and thank you for the tobacco I was given to come here and just do your opening and just share with you and listen in a good way. So Megwich, and that's it for me, Megwich. Thank you.